Universalist Church's covenant. The beliefs of your covenant are realized in the concept of servant leadership. I've had a long career as a middle manager in government. During my career, I always felt that leadership was important, and I tried to assimilate as much as I could about the subject. I'm a graduate of the inaugural class of the Cleveland State University Leadership Academy and Leadership Toledo. I've read numerous leadership books by Stephen R. Covey, James A. Belasco, Ralph Steyer, and numerous others. I learned in these books about buffaloes, hedgehogs, fishes, and getting the right people on the bus and the wrong people off the bus. For example, in the book, Fish, A Remarkable Way to Boost Morale and Improve Results by Stephen Lundeen, Harry Paul, and John Christensen, it uses the Pike Place Fish Company in Seattle, Washington, as the model for a fun place to work. That fun environment includes throwing fishes. Is to bring your whole self to work. The 4 lessons of the book can be summarized as: be there. When people need you, then you need to be 100% present, both mentally and emotionally, without distraction. Without taking yourself too seriously. Appreciation and recognition make people feel valued. When you help a person feel good, you also feel good. Start each day by selecting your attitude. Your attitude should help the people who depend on you. Some companies make the leap and others don't, by Jim Collins, who's a former Stanford business professor, analyzed 11 companies that went from average results to 3 times better results. Learned from that book include becoming a level 5 leader. Having the right idea is subordinate to creating the correct team. First, you should act more like a hedgehog and less like a fox. For example, stop doing to-do lists, because as important as to-do lists are also not to-do lists. The leadership that I found was Robert K. Greenleaf. He was an authentic voice with a provocative concept called servant leadership. Roots. He was born in 1904 in Terre Haute, Indiana. He started college at what is now Rose-Hulman University, but at that time was called Rose Polytechnic. He ultimately graduated with a major in math from Carleton College in Minnesota. Following graduation, he took a job with one of what was then the largest organizations in the world, American Telephone and Telegraph, now known as AT&T. In 1929, he was transferred to the AT&T headquarters in New York City. He worked for AT&T for 38 years. He served as Director of Management Development. In this role, he created the world's first Management Assessment Center. More importantly, he was an early promoter of women and minorities to white-collar and professional positions. Furthermore, he educated managers in the humanities, teaching them about the impact of corporate actions on communities. In 1964, he retired from AT&T and started a second career as an author, teacher, and consultant. Robert published his provocative essay, The Servant as Leader. His perspective was that leaders were first and foremost servants. The critical tools for leaders were listening, persuasion, access to intuition and planning, the importance of the use of language, and tracking results. In 1976, Paulus Press published Greenleaf's first book, titled Servant Leadership, A Journey into the Nature of Legitimate Power and Greatness. Leader was based on the character of Leo in Hermann Hesse's book, Journey to the East. Leo, although only a servant doing menial chores, is the central figure in a fictional journey where he sustains his fellow voyagers both in spirit and song. The group falls apart, and the journey is canceled. As it turns out, Leo was a leader all the time, but he was an authentic servant first. To modeling the servant leader on his dad as well. Predicted that the lack of confidence in institutions that we see today, when he stated in his book that the only institutions deserving allegiance by followers will be those that act in response and proportion to the clearly evident servant stature of the leader. Followers will only trust and follow leaders that are proven servants. Greenleaf defines servant leadership as being a servant first rather than a leader or manager first. Leader is to assure that the most important needs of other people are being served rather than the needs of the leader. It's incredibly simple. It is also fundamentally radical. It means that the chief executive officer, the CEO, puts the needs of the workers, customers, and communities ahead of the CEO's own needs. The CEO is clearly seen as serving the needs of employees, customers, and communities. In this model, we have effectively flipped the corporate organizational chart upside down. The implications of servant leadership are enormous. Corporations take a long-term view rather than a short-term view. Compensated based on short-term earnings. Be an anachronism. Wage. Change, environmental protection, and other externalities would be calculated as a part of corporate decision-making. Having representatives of workers and communities on their boards of directors. Characteristics that are essential to being a servant leader. The first characteristic is listening and understanding. The paramount role of servant leader is to listen in order to understand. This provides, Lord, grant that I may not seek so much to be understood as to understand. The characteristic of a servant leader is acceptance and empathy. Acceptance is receiving what is offered with approbation, satisfaction, or acquiescence. Empathy is the imaginative projection of one's own consciousness into another being. The opposite is rejection. A servant leader cannot reject and be successful, so one lesson is never to reject. Servant leadership mandates acceptance of people and the tolerance of the imperfect. A bonus for the servant leader is that full acceptance of and empathy for others increases trust in the leader. That Robert Greenleaf was a Quaker during the last half of his life. Leadership was for everybody, all religions, all organizations, whether secular or sacred. consistent with the Quaker belief that God is love. The light of God is in every person. Relationship with God without the need of a minister as an intermediary in the midst of everyday life. Between Quakers and UUs, both value peace and nonviolence. There are no real hierarchies. Wisdom from sacred literature of all faiths is recognized. Revelation, the truth is found within each individual. Equality of all people. A commitment to social justice and service. Religious diversity is valued as a tool for seeking truth. The concept of servant leadership beyond business to boards of directors, boards of trustees, universities, foundations, churches, and seminaries. Orders of Greenleaf and servant leadership are the women who head religious communities of women and religiously affiliated healthcare systems. After 60 years as a Catholic, I know that generally nuns are usually right and their actions should be followed. Religious sisters who serve as the leadership team of the Sisters of St. Francis. They guided their order around the concept of servant leadership for their 4-year leadership term. With Christian thinking. Jesus and St. Francis were servant leaders. Servant leaders think of others first and not themselves. The best image of servant leadership is of Jesus washing the feet of others at the Last Supper and taking care of the needs of others. Servant leadership in a religious community consists of listening to sister members of the community who will be most impacted by community actions. The priority is on listening to community members articulate their needs rather than viewing member needs through the leader's own needs and wants. There's an additional Hoosier connection to Robert Greenleaf. For several decades, the nonprofit Robert K. Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership was headquartered in the Indianapolis area. The center was originally founded in 1964 as the Center for Applied Ethics. The name was changed in 1985 to the Robert K. Greenleaf Center. This international educational organization seeks to support and encourage the practice of servant leadership. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a complicated one. Writes, the Kennedys used federal marshals and soldiers to enforce integration laws and court decisions. The Kennedys also permitted FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to wiretap Dr. King's telephones. The Kennedys' presidential legislative agenda was somewhat sidetracked by civil rights issues and legislation. 1968, the night Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, one of the most visible moments of servant leadership occurred in Indianapolis. To speak that night at a park at Broadway and 17th Street in Indianapolis. Local officials sought to cancel his appearance due to concerns for his safety. Servant leader, and he put the needs of his listeners first, both white people and black people, of his listeners, and empathized with them. Following remarks. Dedicated his life to love and justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it is perhaps well to ask what kind of nation we are and what direction we want to move in. Evidently, is that there were white people who were responsible. You can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks, white amongst whites, filled with hatred towards one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King Jr. did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that has spread across our land with an effort to understand, compassion, and love. We're tempted to fill with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people. I would only say that I can also feel in my heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. In the United States, we have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond, and to go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair against will comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." It is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion towards one another, and a feeling of justice towards those who will still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. For so I ask you tonight to return home to say a prayer for the family of Martin Luther King. Yeah, it's true, but more importantly, to say a prayer for our country, which is all of us love. And that compassion of which I spoke, we can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It's not the end of violence, it is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And let's dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago: to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Robert Kennedy remained just as relevant in 2023 as 1968. We still have a long way to go to generate the love, compassion, and wisdom that we collectively seek. Servant leadership is the tool for the unselfish to seek a better future by placing the needs of others before their own. Robert Greenleaf is that anybody can be a servant leader. You only need to subordinate your needs to the needs of others and be willing to simultaneously serve and lead. Motivates and animates Unitarian Universalism and our covenants and principles. Embracing diversity and recognizing the wisdom and experience of each person in a really big way. Applying service leadership to churches means that the first priority of a church board and staff is to put church members, guests, and people who are marginalized first. It is the mission of the board and staff to support and assist members, guests, and those who are marginalized. Heartland's board members and leaders are servant leaders who should seek to implement the 7 UU principles as a high priority. Stakeholders as servant leaders should expedite locally and internationally the adoption and implementation of the UU 8th principle, journeying through spiritualism and wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Community can also serve as servant leaders. The members' roles as servant leaders are focused on stewardship, which is defined as the conducting, supervising, or managing of something, especially the careful, responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. Resources to sustain the church's programs and services. Leadership and enrich your professional, family, and spiritual lives. And put the needs of others in front of your own needs and wants. You guarantee the success of your leadership. Successful when leadership seeks to serve the needs of workers, consumers, clients, patients, and church members. Servant leadership offers the radical idea of flipping the traditional pyramid-shaped organizational chart. Organizations exist to serve workers, customers, congregations, and citizens. Serves others. You and your organization receive the bonus of added meaning to your leadership and to your organization. Where servant leadership is practiced also are more likely to support the organization and have a greater loyalty to it. And servant leadership is also good for the organization, its leaders, and members.